Picture yourself standing in the great library of Alexandria as twilight falls across the marble columns. The air carries the scent of papyrus and lamp oil. Shelves stretch into shadow, holding scrolls that contain humanity's accumulated wisdom. But even as you breathe in this moment, you know that most of these treasures will vanish. Fire will come. Water will rot what fire spares. Time will erase what water cannot reach. Tonight, we journey through the Phantom Library, the collection of books that once existed but exist no more. Each lost text is a doorway that closed before we could step through. Each one held secrets, insights, beauty that the world will never know again. These aren't just abstract losses. These are the conversations we can never join, the questions we can never answer, the minds we can never meet. They are the books that haunt the margins of history, present only in their absence. As you settle into this exploration, consider what it means to lose knowledge itself. Not to forget it, but to have it erased so completely that we know it existed only by the shadows it left behind. Let us begin with words that once sang across ancient Greece, poetry so beautiful that its loss still echoes through the centuries. Sappho's 9 books of poetry. Imagine standing on the island of Lesbos around 600 BCE, as the Mediterranean sun sets in colors that seem to have names in languages not yet invented. A woman's voice carries across a gathering, clear, precise, electric with emotion. She sings of love so directly, so intimately, that listeners feel she is speaking only to them. This is Sappho, and in her time she was revered as the 10th muse. 9 complete books of her poetry once existed, carefully preserved and copied, passed from hand to hand across the ancient world. Plato called her wise. Strabo described her as a marvelous thing. For centuries, her words survived. But survival is not the same as permanence. As Christianity spread through the Roman world, Sappho's frank celebration of desire, particularly her love poems addressed to women, became uncomfortable, then dangerous, then intolerable. Around 1073 CE, Pope Gregory VII reportedly ordered her works burned. What fire began, time completed. Of 9 books containing thousands of lines, only 1 complete poem survives, 28 lines preserved on a broken piece of pottery. What did we lose? We lost her voice describing a beloved's laughter as more musical than lyres. We lost poems about jealousy so acute it made the speaker feel she was dying. We lost her observations of nature, her meditations on aging, her thoughts on music and beauty. We lost the full expression of a mind that saw the world in ways that made ancient readers weep and modern scholars search desperately through garbage heaps for fragments. Consider the fragility of beauty. The most exquisite poetry ever written in ancient Greek, widely acknowledged as equal to Homer, simply gone. Not because it lacked value, but because it made someone uncomfortable 1,000 years after it was written. What voices in our own time are we silencing? What perspectives are we allowing to slip away because they challenge us? Because preservation requires active care? Because someone decides certain truths are too uncomfortable to keep? As you drift deeper into this exploration, hold Sappho's lost songs as a reminder. Beauty does not protect itself. Truth does not preserve itself. These require guardians, or they vanish into silence. But if poetry can disappear, what about philosophy? The systematic thinking that shapes how entire civilizations understand reality. Our next loss reveals how entire ways of thinking can vanish with their books. Aristotle's Dialogues. Picture young Aristotle, student of Plato, walking through the groves of Athens. Before he became the methodical scientist, the cataloger of nature, the systematic philosopher whose writings would shape Western thought for 2 millennia, he wrote differently. He wrote dialogues, conversations between characters, exploring ideas through debate and discussion, much like his teacher Plato. These dialogues were famous in the ancient world. Cicero praised their golden flow of eloquence. They were accessible, literary, engaging, the public face of Aristotle's philosophy, meant to be read by educated citizens, not just scholars. But something strange happened after Aristotle's death. His systematic treatises, the dense, technical works we know today, were rediscovered and eventually dominated philosophical discourse. Meanwhile, his more accessible dialogue simply disappeared, every single one. Scholars believe we lost around 30 works, dialogues on justice, on poetry, on philosophy itself. Works where Aristotle spoke in his own voice, revealing his personality, his humor, his development as a thinker. Works that might have shown us the human being behind the systematic genius. Why did the dialogues vanish while the treatises survived? Perhaps because the treatises were teaching materials, constantly copied by students and teachers. Perhaps because systematic philosophy eventually seemed more valuable than literary philosophy. Perhaps simply by accident. A library fire here, a neglected copy there, until no copies remained anywhere. The loss teaches us something unsettling. The survival of ideas isn't always about their quality. Sometimes it's about their usefulness to the people who happen to be copying texts. Sometimes it's sheer randomness. The accessible introduction to Aristotle's thought is gone, while the specialist material survives. Consider your own knowledge. What understanding do you have that exists only in your mind, never written down? What insights would vanish if you forgot to record them? The ancients believed written words were immortal. Aristotle's lost dialogues remind us that even written words need advocates, need readers, need people who care enough to copy them one more time. As we move from philosophical dialogue to epic poetry, the losses grow stranger still. What if Homer, the foundational poet of Western literature, wrote works we've never seen? What if his greatest comedy is simply lost? Homer's Margites lost comedy. The ancient Greeks knew Homer as the author of tragedy and grandeur, the Iliad's warfare, the Odyssey's homecoming. But they also knew him as the author of something very different. The Margites, a comic poem about a fool so spectacular, so perfectly incompetent that his story became legendary. Margites was a character who couldn't count past 5, who didn't know which of his parents had given birth to him, who approached his wedding night with such comical ignorance that ancient audiences apparently roared with laughter. Aristotle himself referenced the Margites in his Poetics, calling it Homer's contribution to comedy, just as the Iliad and Odyssey were his contributions to tragedy. But sometime between Aristotle's references and our own era, the Margites vanished. Only a handful of fragments survive, perhaps 70 words scattered across quotes in other ancient texts. Not enough to reconstruct the story, not enough to hear Homer's comic voice. What did we lose? We lost Homer's humor, his satire, his ability to make people laugh. We lost an entire dimension of the founding poet of Western literature. Every student learns Homeric epic, heroic, grand, tragic. But we cannot learn Homeric comedy. We cannot see how the same mind that created Achilles and Odysseus also created a fool so perfect he defined foolishness. This loss reveals something profound about preservation. We tend to preserve what seems serious, important, weighty. Comedy, satire, humor, these are easier to dismiss, easier to let slip away. After all, we have the important works. We have the epics. Do we really need the comedy? But perhaps understanding a culture's humor is essential to understanding the culture itself. Perhaps knowing what made the ancient Greeks laugh would tell us more about them than another tragic speech. Perhaps in losing the Margites, we lost not just a poem, but a key to understanding how Homer's contemporaries saw their own world. Think about the jokes you tell, the humor you share. 1,000 years from now, will anyone know what made your generation laugh? Will they understand your satire, your irony, your absurdity? Or will they have only your serious documents, your formal writings, and miss entirely the spirit that animated your daily life? As you sink deeper into contemplation, consider this. If even Homer's comedy could vanish, what hope did works of pure science have? And yet, One scientific text survived against impossible odds, only to be lost again in a way that still haunts mathematicians. Archimedes' The Method. Imagine a brilliant mind working in Syracuse, Sicily, around 250 BCE. Archimedes, perhaps the greatest mathematician of antiquity, is discovering principles that won't be fully rediscovered for nearly 2,000 years. He's found ways to calculate areas and volumes that anticipate integral calculus. He's glimpsed the infinite. And crucially, he's writing down not just his results, but his method, how he thinks, how he discovers, how he verifies mathematical truths. This work, The Method, is his gift to future mathematicians, not just what he learned, but how he learned it. For centuries, the text survives, copied and recopied. Then, sometime around the 10th century CE, a scribe needs parchment. Parchment is expensive, difficult to produce. But here's an old mathematics text, its contents seeming obscure and useless, perfect for recycling. The scribe scrapes off Archimedes' words and writes a prayer book over them, creating what's called a palimpsest, a manuscript with one text layered over another. For nearly 1,000 years, the method exists only as ghost words beneath prayers, until 1906, when a scholar named Johann Ludwig Heiberg notices something strange about a prayer book in Constantinople. Beneath the visible text, he can make out mathematical diagrams. It's Archimedes. It's the method. It survived. The text is photographed, partially transcribed, but then in the chaos of the early 20th century it vanishes again. For decades, no one knows where it is. Finally, in 1998, it reappears at auction, damaged, partially destroyed, but present. Modern imaging technology has now recovered much of Archimedes' original text from beneath the prayers. We can read his thoughts on infinity, on infinitesimals, on the methods that let him anticipate calculus. But parts remain lost, scraped away too thoroughly to recover. The story of the method teaches us something profound about value. To one generation, Archimedes' mathematical insights were important enough to copy and preserve. To another, they were less valuable than blank parchment for prayers. To us, they're priceless fragments of human genius. What knowledge are you dismissing today that future generations would treasure? What insights are you erasing, overwriting, discarding, because they seem less important than whatever you need the space for now? The palimpsest reminds us that preservation is an active choice, renewed in every generation. We keep what we value, and sometimes, tragically, we destroy what we simply failed to value enough. But if one mathematician's method could vanish and return, what of an entire tradition of drama? What if most of what the greatest Greek playwright ever wrote simply disappeared into time's void? Aeschylus' lost tragedies. Picture the theater of Dionysus in Athens, carved into the hillside, holding 17,000 spectators. The year is around 470 BCE, and Aeschylus, the father of tragedy itself, is presenting a new trilogy. The audience watches in silence as his words transform actors into gods, heroes, furies. By the time the sun sets, they have witnessed something that will echo through literature for millennia. Aeschylus wrote approximately 90 plays. We have 7. 83 tragedies gone, vanished, lost so completely that for most we don't even have plot summaries, just titles on ancient lists. The Bone Gatherers, The Weighing of Souls, The Daughters of Helios, names that hint at stories we can never know. What we do have, The Seven Survivors, revolutionized drama. The Orstia trilogy traces blood vengeance transforming into justice through law. Prometheus Bound shows divine power confronting defiant truth. Each play that survived is a masterwork. Each one makes us wonder, if these 7 survived by chance, what wonders were in the 83 that didn't? Ancient writers quoted the lost plays occasionally, giving us fragments, sometimes just a single line. In war, truth is the first casualty. That survived, but the play it came from didn't. We have the wisdom Aeschylus discovered, but not the human drama that produced it. The loss reveals something about cultural transmission. These plays weren't lost because they were bad. They were lost because they required active copying, and eventually people stopped copying them. Perhaps they seemed old-fashioned. Perhaps they covered myths people had tired of. Perhaps the 7 that survived were simply the ones copied most often by students and teachers until they became canonical, leaving the others to fade away. Think about the stories you tell, the insights you've dramatized, the truths you've put into human form. What ensures they'll survive beyond you? What makes someone copy them one more time, choose them over something else, keep them alive when preservation is always a choice? Aeschylus's lost plays haunt the edges of literature like shapes in mist. We know they existed. We know they mattered. We know his contemporaries found them powerful enough to preserve for centuries. But time is not a neutral guardian. Time requires advocates. And eventually, the advocates for those 83 plays stopped coming. As we move from Greek theater into deeper mysteries, the terrain shifts. No longer just literary or philosophical works, but texts that claim to unlock reality's hidden mechanisms. The next group of lost books promised nothing less than secret knowledge, and perhaps that's exactly why they vanished. The Book of Thoth. Imagine ancient Egypt, where wisdom is carved in stone and written on papyrus, where scribes hold power because they hold knowledge, and where the god Thoth, ibis-headed, keeper of sacred words, is said to have authored the ultimate book of magic and wisdom. The Book of Thoth supposedly contained the secret knowledge of the gods themselves, instructions for commanding the forces of nature, spells to speak with the dead, insights into the structure of reality that would grant the reader power over life and death. According to legend, the book was hidden in a golden box, nested in a silver box, nested in boxes of precious materials, and sunk in the Nile, guarded by serpents. Did it exist? Perhaps. Several Egyptian magical texts reference the words of Thoth or the Book of Thoth. Later Greek and Roman writers claimed the book existed and that its wisdom was too dangerous for ordinary people. By the medieval period, alchemists and mystics were actively searching for it, convinced that whoever possessed the Book of Thoth would possess ultimate knowledge. But no Book of Thoth has ever been found. What we have instead are numerous texts claiming to be the Book of Thoth or claiming to draw on its wisdom, grimoires, magical papyri, hermetic treatises. Are these fragments of the original, complete fabrications, garbled transmissions of ancient knowledge? We cannot know. The loss, if it was ever more than a legend, represents something different from our earlier examples. This isn't the accidental destruction of a philosophical dialogue or the careless erasure of a mathematical text. This is a book that might have been deliberately hidden, deliberately protected, deliberately kept from general knowledge. Throughout history, certain knowledge has been considered too dangerous for widespread access. Religious mysteries restricted to initiates, military technologies classified for security, techniques for making poisons or weapons kept from those who might misuse them. The Book of Thoth represents the archetype of forbidden knowledge, powerful and perilous in equal measure. But here's the deeper question. If such a book existed and was lost, is that a tragedy or a safeguard? If it contained genuine secrets of power, perhaps its loss protects us from knowledge we're not ready to handle. Or perhaps the real book was never hidden at all. Perhaps the real secrets of Thoth were always available in fragments, scattered across texts, waiting for someone wise enough to recognize and assemble them. As you contemplate this, consider the knowledge you choose not to share, the insights you keep to yourself because you judge others unready for them. How do we balance the preservation of knowledge against the protection from knowledge? How do we decide what should be remembered and what should be forgotten? The Book of Thoth may be legend, but the question it represents is eternal. Some knowledge wants to be free, while other knowledge wants to be guarded. And when guarded knowledge is lost, we can never know if we lost treasure or dodged catastrophe. But if ancient Egypt held secrets that vanished, what of the foundations of Christianity itself? The next lost works aren't legends. They're real texts that shaped early Christian thought before being deemed too dangerous to keep. Lost Gospels. Picture the early days of Christianity, decades after Jesus' death, when his followers are still trying to understand what happened, what it meant, what they should believe. Stories circulate. Sayings are shared. Different communities develop different texts, different gospels, different ways of telling the story. We know 4 Gospels made it into the Bible: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But the early church had dozens more. The Gospel of Thomas, discovered in 1945, contains 114 sayings attributed to Jesus, some familiar, some deeply strange. Split a piece of wood and I am there. Lift up a stone and you will find me there. This gospel presents a more mystical, less biographical Jesus than the canonical Gospels. The Gospel of Mary depicts Mary Magdalene as a leader of the disciples, teaching them wisdom that Jesus revealed to her privately. This vision of female spiritual authority was deeply threatening to the emerging church hierarchy. The Gospel of Judas, also rediscovered in modern times, presents Judas not as a traitor but as Jesus' most faithful disciple, the only one who understood the necessity of Jesus' death. These and dozens of other texts, the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Philip, the infancy Gospel of Thomas, depicting a child Jesus working miracles, circulated widely in early Christian communities. But when church authorities began standardizing Christian doctrine in the 4th century, they declared many of these texts heretical. Copies were destroyed. Possession became dangerous. The texts vanished from circulation. We know about them only because they were quoted in attacks on heresy, or because a few copies survived hidden in jars buried in the Egyptian desert, or because monastery libraries happened to preserve them. What did we lose? Alternative visions of what Christianity could have been, different understandings of Jesus' message, theological debates that might have enriched Christian thought rather than being erased, the voices of early Christian communities whose experiences and insights were deemed unacceptable. The lost Gospels reveal how history gets written by those with the power to decide what texts survive. Orthodoxy is partly about belief and partly about access to copying facilities. The views that survived weren't necessarily the truest or most insightful. They were the ones held by people with the authority and resources to make copies and destroy competing texts. This loss continues to shape Christianity today. Every Christian has been formed by a particular selection of ancient texts, while other ancient Christian texts gather dust in archives or remain lost entirely. We practice a Christianity that might have been very different if different texts had survived. Consider the ideas you've been taught not to question, the perspectives you've never encountered because someone decided they were too dangerous or too wrong to preserve. How much of what you believe is shaped by what you've had access to rather than by truth itself? How would your understanding change if the lost alternatives were suddenly recovered? The lost Gospels whisper an uncomfortable truth. Every tradition is partly a library of what survived and partly a graveyard of what was destroyed. And we can never fully know what wisdom was buried in those graves. If Christianity buried its alternatives, other ancient traditions faced even more complete destruction. Our next lost book represents an entire cosmology that tried to reconcile the major religions of its time, before being systematically hunted to extinction. The Book of Enoch. Before Genesis was Genesis, there were older stories, stranger stories, stories that Judaism eventually decided were too wild, too mythological, too difficult to explain to preserve in the official canon. The Book of Enoch is one of these. Or rather, books of Enoch. There were several, and most are lost or survive only in fragments. What we can still read in the surviving portions is extraordinary. Angels descending to earth and teaching humans forbidden knowledge. Giants born from the union of angels and human women. Enoch himself traveling through heaven, meeting archangels, witnessing the imprisonment of fallen angels, learning the secrets of creation, prophecies of judgment, astronomical mysteries, a vision of reality that's more cosmic fantasy than anything in the canonical Bible. For centuries, these texts were beloved in certain Jewish communities. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in 1947, contained multiple copies of Enochic texts, suggesting they were widely read at the time of Jesus. Early Christians quoted Enoch as scripture. The Epistle of Jude in the New Testament explicitly references the Book of Enoch. But gradually, religious authorities became uncomfortable with these texts. Too much emphasis on angels as independent powers, too much focus on secret knowledge, too many details that contradicted emerging theological orthodoxy. By the 4th century CE, most of the Enochic texts had been removed from Jewish and Christian canons, and many were lost entirely. What survives does so almost by accident. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church kept the Book of Enoch as canonical scripture when other churches abandoned it, preserving a complete text in Ge'ez translation. Other fragments survived in Greek, Aramaic, and other languages. But several Enochic books are completely lost. We know they existed only because ancient catalogs mention them. What did we lose? An entire strand of Jewish and early Christian mysticism. A vision of human history as cosmic conflict between angelic powers. Texts that might have sustained very different religious traditions if they'd remained widely available. The loss of the Enochic literature shows how canonical decisions shape the range of acceptable religious imagination. Once texts are declared non-canonical, they lose institutional support, stop being copied, and often vanish. What we consider orthodox becomes not just the preferred interpretation, but sometimes the only interpretation available. As you rest in this exploration, consider the stories that shape your worldview. How many of them survived because they fit someone else's idea of what was acceptable? How many alternative stories were lost because they asked uncomfortable questions or proposed unsettling answers? The Book of Enoch and its lost companions remind us that every religious tradition has a shadow library, texts that once mattered, that once shaped belief, but that were eventually deemed too strange, too threatening, or too uncontrollable to keep alive. But if religious texts could be deliberately suppressed, what of texts that promised power more directly, alchemical and magical books that claimed to reveal the transformation of matter and spirit? The next loss takes us into the shadowy world where mysticism meets early science. Emerald Tablet. In the history of alchemy, one text stands above all others in influence and mystery. The Emerald Tablet, also called the Smaragdine Table, supposedly discovered in the tomb of Hermes Trismegistus, thrice great Hermes, a legendary sage who may never have existed. The tablet's core text is short, just a dozen or so lines, depending on the translation. But those lines supposedly contain the entire secret of alchemy compressed into symbolic language. As above, so below, as within, so without. The sun is its father, the moon its mother. What I have to say is complete regarding the operation of the sun. For over 1,000 years, alchemists, mystics, and early scientists obsessed over these cryptic phrases. Isaac Newton translated the Emerald Tablet, trying to extract its secrets. Medieval alchemists wrote thousands of pages of commentary, each convinced they'd unlocked the true meaning. But here's the mystery. We have the text of the Emerald Tablet. It's been copied and recopied for centuries. What we've lost is something else entirely. The original context, the original language, the original understanding. The oldest versions we have are in Arabic, from around the 8th century CE. But these claim to be translations from earlier Greek or Coptic texts, and those were supposedly translations from ancient Egyptian. If an original ever existed, it's lost. We have only copies of claimed translations, each generation understanding the words slightly differently, adding their own interpretations, erasing others. More profoundly, we've lost the tradition that could actually interpret the Emerald Tablet. The symbols made sense within a particular worldview, a particular set of practices, a particular community of practitioners. As that community dispersed, as their oral traditions died out, the text remained, but its meaning became progressively more opaque. It's like having sheet music but not knowing what the symbols mean. The notation survives, but the music is lost. What did we lose? Perhaps a genuine methodology for understanding the relationship between spirit and matter. Perhaps an early scientific insight about the unity of nature, expressed in the symbolic language available at the time. Perhaps elaborate nonsense that never meant anything concrete. We can't know, because we've lost the context that would let us distinguish wisdom from mystification. The Emerald Tablet represents a particular kind of loss, not the loss of a text itself, but the loss of the ability to understand the text. How many books do we possess but can no longer truly read because we've lost the cultural context, the background assumptions, the practical knowledge that gave them meaning? Consider the things you know but cannot easily explain, skills learned through practice, intuitions developed over years, understandings that resist translation into words. If you tried to write them down for someone without your experience, how much would be lost in transmission? How much depends on context you can't convey? The Emerald Tablet survived but became a riddle, and perhaps that's its own kind of vanishing, present but unreachable, preserved but incomprehensible, a message in a language we can read but no longer understand. From mystical alchemy to state-sanctioned prophecy, our next loss reveals what happens when religious authority and political power combine to control access to the future itself. Sibylline books. Imagine ancient Rome, around 500 BCE. The city is young, vulnerable, uncertain. A mysterious woman arrives, one of the Sibyls, oracular priestesses said to speak prophecy in ecstatic trances. She offers to sell the Roman king 9 books of prophecies for an enormous price. The king refuses. She burns 3 books and offers the remaining 6 for the same price. He refuses again. She burns 3 more and offers the final 3 books for the original price of 9. This time, he buys them. These Sibylline books were kept in the temple of Jupiter, guarded by special priests, consulted only in times of crisis. When Rome faced plague, war, or political upheaval, the Senate would authorize consulting the Sibylline books for guidance. The prophecies were cryptic, usually recommending specific religious rituals or sacrifices to appease the gods. The books shaped Roman religion for centuries. Based on their pronouncements, Rome adopted foreign deities, instituted new festivals, built temples. They were among Rome's most sacred possessions. But they were also dangerous, politically dangerous. Whoever controlled access to the Sibylline books controlled what the gods supposedly demanded. Whoever could interpret them held enormous power. So access was tightly restricted, and the books themselves were kept secret. In 83 BCE, fire destroyed the original Sibylline books. The Senate immediately authorized collecting new oracular texts from around the Mediterranean to replace them. But this new collection was just that, a collection of various prophecies, not the original books with whatever authority made a king purchase them at such cost. By the time Christianity became Rome's official religion, the Sibylline books had become an embarrassment, pagan prophecy in a Christian empire. They were consulted for the last time in 408 CE, then likely destroyed or abandoned. What did we lose? We can't know because the books were always secret. We have dozens of later texts claiming to be Sibylline prophecies, written by Christians, Jews, and pagans, each claiming ancient authority. But the original books, gone before anyone who might have preserved them had the chance. The Sibylline books represent the loss of knowledge that was deliberately kept secret. Unlike Sappho's poetry or Aeschylus's plays, which were public and loved but accidentally lost, The Sibylline books were hidden by design, and that secrecy ensured that when the political situation changed, when the priesthood that guarded them lost power, there was no public memory to insist on preservation. How much knowledge exists in your world in guarded spaces, classified documents, proprietary research, family secrets, traditional knowledge shared only within communities? When the guardians die or the power structure changes, how much of that hidden knowledge simply vanishes because it was never public enough for anyone else to care about preserving? The Sibylline books remind us that secrecy and preservation work against each other. The more tightly you guard knowledge, the more vulnerable it becomes to complete loss when the guards change. From Roman prophecy to Persian wisdom, the next lost texts represented an entire religion's attempt to reconcile good and evil, light and darkness, in a cosmic drama that might have reshaped Western theology if it had survived. Manichaean texts. In the 3rd century CE, a prophet named Mani arose in Persia, claiming to complete the work of Buddha, Zoroaster, and Jesus. He founded Manichaeism, a religion that would spread from Spain to China, attract millions of followers including the young Augustine of Hippo, and then be systematically hunted to extinction. Mani was unusual among religious founders. He insisted his teachings be written down during his lifetime, in his own hand. He created beautiful illustrated books, believing that visual beauty would help spread his message. He wrote in multiple languages to reach different audiences. Manichaeism may have had more carefully documented founding texts than any other ancient religion. The core teaching was dualism, reality as an eternal struggle between light and darkness, spirit and matter, good and evil. Human souls were fragments of light trapped in material bodies, yearning to return to their divine source. Salvation came through knowledge, through asceticism, through gradually freeing the light from matter's prison. This cosmology threatened both Christianity and Zoroastrianism. If matter was inherently evil, then the Christian God who created the material world couldn't be perfectly good. If good and evil were equal and eternal, then the ultimate triumph of good wasn't guaranteed. If salvation came through knowledge rather than faith or good works, then religious institutions lost their authority. So Christian emperors and Persian kings declared Manichaeism heretical. Manichaean texts were systematically destroyed. Followers were executed. By the 14th century, Manichaeism had been completely eradicated, one of the few major religions to be deliberately extinguished. Until the 20th century, we knew Manichaeism only from its enemies' attacks. We had no actual Manichaean texts, just Christian and Muslim polemics describing their heresies. Then, miraculously, Manichaean books began to be discovered in Central Asian caves, in Egyptian deserts, in Chinese Silk Road sites. Fragments, sometimes just pages, but enough to hear Mani's actual voice. What we've recovered is astonishing. Creation myths of light beings trapped by demons of darkness, hymns of longing for spiritual home, intricate cosmologies explaining how light became mixed with matter. But what we have is tiny compared to what was lost. Mani's own writings, mostly gone. The vast Manichaean literature that existed for 1,000 years. Fragments. We lost an entire religious tradition that might have balanced Christianity's materialism with spiritual transcendence, that proposed that the physical world's suffering was evidence not of human sin, but of matter's inherent corruption, that suggested salvation through enlightenment rather than through faith or works. More broadly, we lost the chance to see what a religion looks like when its founder writes its scriptures personally, when visual art is integral to theology, when missionary work deliberately adapts to local cultures while maintaining a core message. Consider the ideas you've dismissed as heretical, dangerous, or simply wrong. How many of them were never fairly considered, never preserved in their advocates' own words, known only through their opponents' criticisms? How different would your understanding be if you could hear those ideas directly rather than through hostile summaries? Manichaeism's near-complete erasure reminds us that religious tolerance isn't about letting ideas compete freely. It's about resisting the impulse to destroy ideas we find threatening. Once destruction begins, once burning books seems justified, knowledge that might have enriched humanity for millennia can vanish in a generation. But if even complete religions could be erased, what of single books so holy that their very titles became legendary? The next loss is barely a book at all, just a reference in another text, a title that echoes through history with no content attached. Book of the Wars of the Lord. In the biblical Book of Numbers, chapter 21, there's a strange moment. The text is describing the Israelites' journey through the wilderness, and suddenly it quotes from another book. Therefore it is said in the Book of the Wars of the Lord. Then a few lines of ancient poetry about battles and places. And that's it. That's all we have from the Book of the Wars of the Lord, a quotation of a quotation, a reference to a text that once existed but exists no more. Biblical scholars believe this book was a collection of ancient Hebrew war poetry, songs celebrating victories attributed to divine intervention. Think of it as a Bronze Age equivalent of a national epic, the stories of how Israel's army won battles because their God fought for them. The Book of Numbers was written down sometime between the 6th and 5th centuries BCE. But the Book of the Wars of the Lord is quoted as already ancient, already an established source, suggesting it was created centuries earlier, perhaps during the time of Judges or early monarchy. Which means we're talking about Hebrew poetry from roughly 1200 BCE, contemporary with the Trojan War, predating Homer, preserving oral traditions from when Israel was still a loose confederation of tribes rather than a unified kingdom. All lost. We have only that fragment, that quotation, that proof something once existed. What did we lose? The authentic voice of ancient Israel's military tradition, poetry that shaped how Israelites understood warfare as a religious act, stories that might reveal how early Hebrew religion differed from later, more developed forms. The raw, unedited mythology before monotheism was fully established. More hauntingly, we lost something the Bible's own authors considered important enough to quote, a source they trusted, a text they valued enough to reference even though they knew their audience might not have access to it. The Book of the Wars of the Lord represents the ghostliest kind of loss, a book we know existed only because another book mentions it. It's like hearing someone mention my favorite novel in a letter, but the letter never says what novel, and the novel itself is nowhere to be found. How many books have vanished leaving not even a trace? How many texts were never important enough to be quoted elsewhere, never famous enough to be listed in ancient catalogs, simply forgotten so completely that we don't even know they're missing? As you contemplate this absence, consider the knowledge that depends on single points of preservation. The book only one person owns. The tradition was carried only in one teacher's memory. The understanding that exists only in one manuscript. When that single copy burns, when that person dies, when that manuscript crumbles, the knowledge doesn't gradually fade. It vanishes instantly and completely. The Book of the Wars of the Lord whispers from across 3,000 years. It existed, it mattered, and now it's gone. And we remember it only because someone quoted 2 lines. From biblical fragments to philosophical systems, the next group of losses takes us into the heart of ancient Greek thought, where entire ways of understanding reality were written down in detail and then simply erased. Democritus's The Great World System. Picture ancient Greece, around 400 BCE. While Plato and Socrates were developing theories of ideal forms and philosopher kings, another thinker was proposing something radically different. That reality consists entirely of atoms and void. Democritus of Abdera argued that everything, stars, humans, thoughts, souls, is made of invisibly small, indivisible particles moving through empty space. Different atoms have different shapes and combine in different ways to create the diversity of existence. Nothing is created or destroyed, only rearranged. No gods needed. No purpose or design, just atoms following natural laws. This was materialism centuries before it would become scientifically respectable. This was something remarkably close to modern atomic theory, developed through pure reasoning 23 centuries before we could actually observe atoms. And Democritus wrote it all down. He was prolific. Ancient catalogs list over 70 works covering physics, mathematics, ethics, perception, agriculture, poetry. His masterwork was apparently called the Great World System, or possibly the Great Cosmos, where he laid out his atomic theory in systematic detail. All lost. Every single book Democritus wrote. We have only fragments, quotes preserved by later philosophers, usually in works criticizing materialism. Maybe 300 lines total, scattered across dozens of sources, torn from context. We know Aristotle read Democritus and took him seriously enough to refute him carefully. We know later atomists like Epicurus built on his work. But we don't have Democritus's own arguments, his evidence, his reasoning. We don't know how he dealt with obvious objections or what led him to such a counterintuitive theory. Why was Democritus lost when Plato and Aristotle survived? Partly because Christian and Islamic scholars preferred idealist and teleological philosophies, philosophies where God and purpose matter, over godless materialism. Partly because Aristotle's refutations were so influential that people stopped reading the original. Partly just chance. But the loss matters enormously. If Democritus's full works had survived, Western philosophy and science might have developed very differently. The materialist tradition might have remained strong through the Middle Ages rather than being marginalized. The scientific revolution might have come centuries earlier. More personally, we lost the thoughts of someone who saw through religious and philosophical assumptions to propose that reality is fundamentally simple, mechanical, and comprehensible. Someone who argued that you don't need gods or purposes or cosmic meaning to explain why things are the way they are. You just need atoms and the void. Consider the ideas you've encountered that challenged your fundamental assumptions about reality. Now imagine those ideas were never preserved, never passed on, lost so completely that future generations don't even know they were proposed. What would humanity lose if the most challenging ideas, the ones that question everything, consistently fail to survive? Democritus's lost works remind us that preservation often favors the orthodox and the comfortable. Revolutionary ideas, ideas that threaten established worldviews, ideas that make people uncomfortable, these are more vulnerable to loss. And when they're lost, we lose not just the ideas but the possibility of building on them. If materialism was too challenging for preservation, what about direct challenges to the gods themselves? The next loss is even more provocative. A philosopher who questioned whether the gods existed at all, in a society where such questioning could be lethal. Protagoras on the gods. Imagine Athens, the birthplace of democracy and philosophy, around 420 BCE. A respected teacher named Protagoras publicly reads from a new book. Its opening lines are electric. Concerning the gods, I cannot say whether they exist or do not exist, nor what form they might have, for there is much to prevent one from knowing, the obscurity of the subject and the brevity of human life. This was agnosticism stated clearly for the first time in Western philosophy. Not atheism. Protagoras wasn't claiming gods don't exist, but something almost more radical, the claim that we can't know, that the question might be unanswerable, that uncertainty itself is the proper philosophical stance toward the divine. The Athenians were not amused. Protagoras was charged with impiety. His book on the gods was collected from everyone who owned a copy and burned in the public square. Protagoras himself fled Athens and died in a shipwreck while escaping prosecution. And his book was lost, completely, Not a single copy survived the burning. We have only that opening statement, preserved in later works that quoted it as an example of dangerous thinking. What did we lose? The first systematic Western argument for religious agnosticism, Protagoras' reasoning, his evidence, his responses to objections, his thoughts on how to live ethically without certain knowledge of divine will, his analysis of why religious belief is so powerful despite its uncertainty. We lost a book so dangerous that one of the most intellectually open societies in history couldn't tolerate its existence. A book that questioned the fundamental assumptions of ancient life, that the gods were real, knowable, and relevant to human affairs. But we also lost something broader, the confidence that difficult questions deserve honest answers rather than comfortable lies. Protagoras was saying, "I don't know about the most important question his society asked," and his society responded by destroying the book and threatening his life. The loss of On the Gods reveals how intellectual courage can be punished rather than rewarded. Protagoras wasn't promoting immorality or chaos, he was admitting uncertainty. But even that was too much. How many times have you witnessed honesty punished because the truth was uncomfortable? How many times have you seen questions suppressed because the potential answers might upset established beliefs? How often does uncertainty, honest admission of "I don't know," get treated as weakness or heresy rather than intellectual integrity? Consider what we might learn if all the suppressed questions, all the burned books, all the dangerous thoughts could be recovered. Not because they're all correct, but because grappling with difficult questions strengthens understanding even when the questions have no easy answers. Protagoras' lost book whispers across centuries. Some knowledge is lost not accidentally but deliberately, destroyed because what it says is too challenging for its society to tolerate. And in that destruction, we lose not just the specific knowledge but the tradition of asking questions that might not have comfortable answers. From philosophical courage to mathematical brilliance, the next losses remind us that even genius recognized in its own time can vanish if the wrong people hold the power over what gets preserved. Hypatia's mathematical treatises. Picture Alexandria, Egypt, around 400 CE. The great library is gone, burned decades earlier, but the city remains a center of learning. In lecture halls filled with students, a woman teaches mathematics, astronomy, philosophy. This is extraordinary. In the ancient world, women rarely received education beyond basic literacy. But Hypatia was the daughter of a mathematician, raised in a household that valued learning over gender conventions. She became not just educated but brilliant, one of the leading intellectuals of her time. She wrote commentaries on mathematical works, including Diophantus's Arithmetica and Apollonius's Conics, complex texts on number theory and geometry. She improved the design of astronomical instruments. She taught Neoplatonist philosophy, combining mathematics with mystical insights into the nature of reality. Students traveled from across the Mediterranean to study with her. Civic leaders consulted her for advice. She was admired, respected, influential, a rare example of a woman wielding intellectual authority in the ancient world. And then in 415 CE, a Christian mob murdered her. The reasons were complex: religious tension between Christians and pagans, political conflicts involving the Bishop of Alexandria, cultural anxiety about a woman holding such public prominence. But the result was simple. Hypatia was dragged from her chariot, killed and dismembered. Her works disappeared. Not immediately, perhaps. Some might have survived for decades or even centuries. But eventually, every mathematical treatise she wrote, every commentary, every original contribution to mathematics or astronomy vanished. We know she wrote these works only because later writers mentioned them. We have references to her thought, quotations from letters she wrote, descriptions of her teaching. but not her actual mathematics, not her philosophical arguments, not her voice. What did we lose? The mathematical innovations of one of the ancient world's greatest minds, her unique synthesis of mathematical precision and philosophical insight, her perspective as a woman succeeding in fields dominated by men, her methods of teaching that made her so effective students traveled continents to study with her. More broadly, we lost the possibility of a different tradition, one where women's mathematical and philosophical contributions were normally preserved, where female intellectual authority was unremarkable rather than scandalous.